and their son Jan, who is, as we know, the father of the Jan we met in 1932
Right.
in concentration camp.
The conditions in these camps are described as incredibly harsh, disease spreading rapidly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The concentration camps were sites of immense hardship, overcrowding, poor sanitation, and disease was everywhere. The impact on these civilian populations, particularly women and children, was devastating. It's a stark reminder of the human cost of conflict. It extends far beyond the actual battlefield.
Yeah. And then Anna becomes ill in the camp and passes away. And her final request to Pieter is protect Jan.
Right.
And it's heart-wrenching, but it's this promise that becomes a central driving force for Pieter.
Anna's death under such awful circumstances really underscores the personal cost of the war.
Yeah.
And her final words are so powerful, they shape his actions and his will to survive.
Right.
It makes you think about the power of those family bonds, even in the worst times.
Absolutely. And so after the war, we see Pieter and young Jan trying to rebuild their lives in Johannesburg from 1902 onwards. And it's such a stark and difficult transition.
Yeah, this move to city life was incredibly challenging for a lot of Afrikaners who had been displaced
Right.
by the war and the economic hardships. They faced poverty,
Yeah.
and they had to try to find work
Yeah.
as unskilled laborers in a racially segregated society,
Yeah.
competing with black laborers.
We see these really specific examples of Pieter's struggles. Manual labor, meager wages, terrible living conditions in Fordsburg,
Yeah.
the constant battle with hunger, and we see how it impacts young Jan. The malnutrition.
It really brings this broad historical narrative
Right.
down to this, human level.
Yeah.
We can really understand the day-to-day realities of displacement, of poverty.
Yeah.
The struggle for basic necessities becomes this central theme that's very relatable, I think.
Absolutely. They eventually moved to Reddedorp, which was this Afrikaner enclave.
Yeah.
And it did provide a sense of community.
It did.
But this community was still grappling with widespread poverty.
Oh, yeah.
So that shared identity offered some support, but didn't erase the hardship.
Right. Afrikaner enclaves like Verderdorp provided a really crucial sense of solidarity,
Right.
cultural connection.
Yeah.
For people who were navigating this rapidly changing
Yeah.
and often unwelcoming environment.
Right.
But they weren't immune to the poverty and the economic challenges of the time.
Yeah. And throughout this whole time, Pieter is focused on providing for Jan, even if it means sacrificing his own well-being.
Yeah.
That promise he made to Anna continues to guide his actions.
Yeah, I mean, Peter's commitment to his son really highlights the strength of family bonds
Yeah.
in the face of adversity.
Yeah.
His personal sacrifices show just how far parents will go to protect their children,
Yeah.
especially in times of crisis.
Absolutely. So then moving into Jan's childhood from the early 1900s up to 1930, we see how this persistent poverty shapes his life. His access to education is limited because he has to work
Right.
to contribute to the family income. And that stigma of being poor white is something they live with daily.
Jan's limited opportunities for education, it unfortunately perpetuates a cycle of poverty, which is a key finding of the Carnegie Commission report. And it's important to understand that report really laid bare the systemic nature of poverty within the Afrikaner community, highlighting things like lack of access to land, limited educational opportunities as these key drivers, and that social stigma on top of it.
Yeah.
This makes it so much worse.
Yeah. And then in the early 1930s, we see Pieter's health declining. They're living in a slum in Johannesburg. And in these final moments, Pieter says this really crucial thing to young Jan: build something they can't take away.
Yeah.
Which is just so profound. And it resonates with Jan in 1932.
Right.
As he's dealing with this bank crisis.
Peter's final words really encapsulate this deep desire for security, independence.
Right.
He's realizing that material possessions, they can be lost or taken, as his life has shown.
Yeah.
But skills, knowledge, strong community bonds, those are much more resilient forms of wealth.
Yeah.
And this becomes a very important principle for Jan.
Yeah. And so Pieter passes away. And this legacy of resilience, of perseverance, it's passed on to Jan, setting the stage for the decisions he has to make in 1932.
Peter's life, it's marked by loss, constant struggle.
Yeah.
It's this powerful backdrop. For Jan's choices in 1932, the weight of his family's history, his father's final words, they play a big role in his actions.
So bringing us back to 1932. Jan uncovers this fraud at the bank.
Yeah.
And he's grappling with this huge conflict.
Yeah.
His family's long history of struggle, his grandfather's legacy, it's all weighing heavily on him.
Yeah.
And he has these conversations with Elsabe, his wife. And they seem to share a commitment to finding a way forward, not just for themselves, but for the community.
Elsabe's role here is vital.
Yeah.
Their shared commitment highlights the importance of partnership.
Right.
When you're going through a really tough time.
Yeah.
And the fact that their focus extends beyond just their family to the wider community shows this real sense of collective responsibility.
Absolutely. And Jan, he starts to understand that these issues that were highlighted in the Carnegie Commission report, these weren't just abstract findings. They are completely interwoven with his family's experience across generations.
This is a crucial realization
Yeah.
that connects the story of the Douets to the larger context.
Right.
Jan starts to see his family's hardships not as just bad luck,
Right.
but as part of this bigger pattern of systemic poverty affecting so many in the Afrikaner community.
And ultimately, Jan makes the decision to confront Willem Botha with this evidence about the bank, even though he knows the potential fallout for himself, for the community.
His decision to confront Willem is so courageous.
Yeah.
Especially when you think about the risks.
Yeah.
But it shows this deep commitment to ethical principles.
Right.
And this willingness to prioritize the long-term well-being of everyone over short-term stability that's built on a lie.
Right.
It's a truly courageous act that seems to be rooted in that legacy of resilience.
Yeah. So the confrontation itself must have been so tense. Jan exposes everything.
Yeah.
And the community's reaction is shock, anger, and despair.
It's understandable when
Yeah.
you think about it. Volksbank wasn't just a place to keep your money.
Right.
It was a symbol of their hopes
Right.
for security, for collective identity.
Right.
So its collapse would have had a huge impact.
Yeah.
So those emotions would have been incredibly raw.
And then Jan has to try to explain his actions to a community that's dealing with all of this.
Yeah.
He becomes the bearer of bad news, which is never easy.
Well,
It's a really isolating position to be in.
it really highlights the difficult position of people who uncover wrongdoing within these tight-knit communities.
Yeah.
Even when they're doing it for the right reasons.
Yeah.
They face anger,
Right.
blame,
Yeah.
even social ostracism
Right.
from those most affected.
Despite this fallout, Jan and Elsabe, they show this resolve to look forward, and they move from the failure of the bank to how they can rebuild and create a better future.
Yeah, their proactive focus on rebuilding, on creating these sustainable solutions,
Right.
instead of just dwelling on the crisis,
Yeah.
is really powerful. They recognize that they need systemic change.
Right.
They need long-term solutions.
And Jan, he's thinking about his grandfather's struggles and makes this vow to create lasting change.
Yeah.
That echo of build something they can't take away.
Right. Jan's determination is directly inspired by the experience of his father,
Right.
his grandfather.
Yeah.
He seems to understand that resilience isn't just about surviving.
Right.
It's about building these stronger, more
Yeah.
equitable structures
Yeah.
that can provide security,
Yeah.
opportunity for the future.
We see them start a small garden,
Yeah.
which is such a powerful symbol.
Yeah, a return to fundamentals.
Yeah.
Self-reliance, community, this tangible representation of their commitment to a better future.
Yeah. But then there's a conversation with Carroll,
Yes.
and he raises this really important question. Who does us include
Right.
in this fight for a better future?
Yeah.
And it's this really crucial moment.
It is. Because it adds a lot of nuance. Even within the Afrikaner community, there were these social and economic divisions.
Right.
Carroll's question forces Jan to consider who benefits from these changes.
Yeah.
It challenges this potentially narrow focus
Right.
and asks, what about inclusivity and social justice?
So as we conclude this deep dive into the Douet family's story,
Yeah.
what would you say are the most crucial takeaways for our listeners?
We see this recurrence of hardship, how historical events like abolition, the Rinderpest, the Anglo-Boer War, they have these lasting impacts on individuals, families, and communities. But we also see the spirit of resilience of the Douet family in the face of these challenges.
Yeah, it's amazing how Pieter's unease about the abolition of slavery, even though he benefited financially, it almost seems to foreshadow these later hardships. It really shows how interconnected things are.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Peter's conflict foreshadows these unresolved issues
Yeah.
of inequality
Right.
that would shape South African society for decades to come.
And both Peter and
Yeah.
John, in their different times, they had to make these incredibly difficult decisions.
Yeah, they had to navigate these really complex situations.
Yeah.
There are no easy answers.
Right.
Their stories show the moral complexities individuals face
Yeah.
when they're confronted with large-scale systemic issues. Alongside these pressures of survival,
Yeah. Right.
they had to make choices with huge consequences.
Yeah.
It highlights the burden of responsibility they carried.
And finally, Jan's resolve to not be defined by this label of poor white, but to actively build a better future for his family and for the community, inspired by his father's legacy. It's a powerful note to end on.
Yeah, it's really a triumph of the human spirit.
Yeah.
A refusal to be defeated. This assertion of agency in the face of adversity. He really embodies resilience, this determination to create positive change, drawing strength from his family's past and his own sense of purpose.
So as you reflect on all of this, what insights can we draw about resilience, about community, about the consequences of societal structures? Think about how these historical threads might resonate with contemporary challenges and your own understanding of history. It's a lot to consider. Thank you for taking this deep dive with us.